So as you know, I'm going to be talking about the superego tonight. I won't get into that now, but to do our meditation, I thought, given that today is solstice and it's the shortest day and the longest night of the year, which then starts getting more light tomorrow, and we're also coming to the holidays, I thought I would do a little different meditation. I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so at the beginning, uh, doing two different heart practices each for 5 minutes, and then we'll just go into a silent sitting of whatever practice you would like to do for the rest of the sitting. We'll sit for about half an hour. So then finding a comfortable posture for yourself where you can be supported and alert and relaxed, and letting go of whatever it took for you to get here on this busy time of year. I'm so impressed that you all made it on the last kind of day before the holiday weekends and weeks start. So just feeling yourself arriving here. And then to start feeling into our hearts. This can be a time of year for people where we spend time with loved ones, friends, people we're close to. And so just bringing to your heart, to mind, loved ones who are you may be seeing or in contact with, those who are you won't be in contact with, and even those who are absent, who may not be with us anymore. Just bringing some attention to your heart and to the contact with them. These times of year can be they can have a lot of complexity. So I thought it'd be good to just have some time where there could be some pure loving kindness, well wishing for the loved ones in our lives, present and absent. Feeling that well wishing for the people we're close to, friends, family members, co-workers, neighbors. And also feeling that same sense of loving kindness for your Sangha members, people here, people who aren't here, but are part of your Dharma Sangha and Dharma friends. And also any other teachers, maybe again, people who are alive, people who have gone on. Just bringing some well wishing to all of these people that we have the heart connections with. And now shifting a bit as we turn our attention out to the world, and it's hard not to be in touch with all of the suffering that's happening around the planet at this time. It seems particularly acute. So I thought it would be a good time to send some compassion, yes, feel some compassion for the many, many people, millions of people around the planet at this time who are suffering, who are in war zones, who may be starving, not have enough to eat, not be sheltered, not have medical care, people who are suffering from oppression and discrimination, people suffering from the effects of climate change, the animals that are also suffering, and the earth itself. So feeling compassion in our hearts for the many, many beings who are facing really extreme difficulties at this moment, and feeling our wishes that they will be able to bear the suffering, or that it will end soon, that they'll have some relief. And then going back to the loving kindness practice, or you're welcome to stay with anything I've already talked about. But we can also go on to feeling the loving kindness, the well wishing for all beings on the planet, beings who are suffering, beings who are enjoying life, beings who are even causing suffering, beings of all races, nationalities, religions, or none, all socioeconomic classes, all continents and countries. Really feeling that intention of well wishing encircling the whole planet, including the animals on the land, sea, and air, and feeling those heartful wishes that all beings may be safe, may be healthy, may be happy, may live with ease, and may be liberated. And we'll be in silence now through the end of the sitting. May all beings be safe. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be happy. May all beings live with ease. May all beings be liberated. Okay, so we'll have a 5-minute stretch and bio break and then start the Dharma talk. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And as always, I invite you to turn on your camera. It's not required, but does help with the sense of Sangha. So just an invitation for that. And I realized that there were a few announcements I forgot, so I'll just add those in now. The first of which is February 3rd and 4th. I'm doing a Zoom retreat on all 4 Brahma Viharas. So it's a weekend Brahma Viharas Zoom retreat. And I have many retreats this year, but in particular wanted to mention the Zoom events. I have the What is Awakening through IMT will also be offered on Zoom as a hybrid. And then I have a half day on Samatha in June. And then in September, I have a day long on Vipassana. And probably for the first time next year, I'll be offering at the end of the year a vision mapping day long, which is really about reflecting on the past year and looking forward and aligning our life with our spiritual practice. So all of this is on the Luminous Mind Sangha website if you're interested in knowing more. Okay, so tonight I'm going to be talking about working with the superego, also sometimes called the inner critic, but I like the term superego better, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you know, how is this something that we might want to look into as part of our spiritual journey? Because this really comes from psychology, and in particular, the way that I'll talk about working with it comes from the Diamond Approach, which is a modern spiritual path that I've been involved with for about 18 years now. And it integrates the psychological and the spiritual. So it's kind of unique in that way that it kind of sees the psychological part of what we are and the spiritual is one continuum. So there's a lot of understanding of how to work with the psychological and why that's important on the spiritual path. So one part of this is the superego. So what is the superego? It's you know, one of the main discoveries that can help us on the spiritual path that we have in our era in the last 100 years is psychology. And through the science and understanding of psychology, we know a lot more about just the nuts and bolts of how the personality is structured. And in Buddhism, we're trying to thin that sense of the me so that we can know our deeper nature that is beyond the conditioned self, that's beyond the physical, beyond the body, and beyond the ego self. And so that we suffer less and we can know our deeper nature. So this is really one of the main things that we're doing in Buddhism and with meditation practices is seeing the places where we get caught in our practice and we suffer, and then potentially seeing beyond those veils that cover our deeper nature, which is unconditioned and which is beyond that. And this is really what the Buddha was pointing to in all of his teachings, was how to know what we are beyond the ego self. So this is why the superego is important, because the superego is a structure in consciousness that basically keeps the ego self in place. That's its job. So if we don't work with the superego, it will come back when we start getting some freedom from the ego self. The superego will come in and try to get us back into the ego self, try to get us kind of back in line. So this is why it's important to work with this on the path, because it can actually kind of derail our practice as we're starting to actually make some headway. The superego will try to get us back into the ego patterns because that's its function. So what is the superego? And we have basically the ego self, which forms when an infant is born. It doesn't have a sense of separation, and as the infant, the infants basically are in what's known as a dual unity. They know their deeper nature. They are their deeper nature, just like animals, but they don't know it. There's no self-reflective consciousness for an infant. And as the infant starts needing things, there's pain, diapers needed change, there's the desire for food. All the solutions to these things come from the outside. And so the infant starts feeling like, this is where I end at the end of the body. And there's an other that is not this body, and all the foods coming from there, all the diaper changing, all the comfort and holding is coming from outside. And so that's where consciousness starts to identify with the body as what we are, and with the sense of separation from the grounded being, and the identification and the sort of lamination of consciousness to the physical body starts developing at that point. And by the age of 2, like a child under that age, if you say, I'm going to the store, they don't know what that means, because there's no sense of separate self. You have to say, mommy's going to the store, daddy's going to the store, so they know what that means. But around the age of 2, with the terrible twos, they start getting a me. And then there's I do it, me do it. There's the terrible twos where they can actually work this body thing and move around on their own and do things. And that's really when the ego self starts forming. And we can see that from how they behave. They're starting to feel like a separate me who could do stuff. And so I won't get into the whole story about the ego self. I have recordings where I spend more time on this, but basically that's when the sense of the separate me starts forming. Certain things get reinforced from the outside, certain things get pushed down, societal conditioning, boys don't cry, girls are sensitive, all these things get programmed into us, and certain things get reinforced and encouraged, and other things get pushed down that may or may not be what our actual nature is. This is how the ego self forms, basically. So we all have ideas of who we are. I'm the smart person, I'm the dumb person. I'm the athletic person, I'm the clumsy person. I'm the attractive person, I'm the ugly person. I'm the list goes on and on. They aren't all good, they aren't all bad. There's a combination for all of us of these things. But these all go into the self-images of who we are, and into our program, into our software program that we really see. The minute we meditate, what we see, like especially if you're doing the samatha practice, for example, where you're coming back to the breath, the small area over and over, you're going to see your patterns real fast because it's hard to do it. And you will see what takes you off of the breath. And basically, you're seeing the building blocks of the ego when you are seeing what takes you off, because those are compulsive grooves in consciousness. And I use the word compulsive not judgmentally, but descriptively, because if we can't not do it, that's the definition of compulsive. So we're seeing what in Buddhism is known as the hindrances and defilements, but to have it be a little more neutral, we're seeing personality patterns. So that forms, 3 to 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And then what happens is the superego comes in to reinforce the ego. And the superego is basically an internalization of the adult caregivers as well as societal messages. And we need this because it allows us to internalize things like, look both ways before you cross the street, things like this, so that we can actually be without the whoever the caregivers are, we can be without them on our own and be okay. But the superego also reinforces who we are. And when we try to break out of that, the superego's job is to come back and get that in place. So this is how it is a problem on the path, because say that we see our patterns on the cushion, like we're, say, worrying all the time. And we can see how much we're suffering because we're worrying all the time. And through practice, we start worrying less. We start seeing how compulsive it is and just realizing I'm hurting myself by ruminating over all these worrying thoughts. I'm going to not do that as much. And we start getting some freedom from the worrying pattern, which is basically a certain kind of aversion. It's the fear category of aversion. And we're more relaxed. We're not looking around for the scary thing all the time. And then the superego comes in and says, better watch out. If you're not careful, you're going to get hurt. You're going to miss something. And then it uses every little thing that reinforces that to prove that it's right, to get you to go back into that ego pattern. So this is where on the path, if we don't know that this is happening, when we start getting some freedom, the superego will just push us back there, basically. So if we have an ego self, and we know from in Theravada Buddhism, there's even with awakening, there's still 4 stages of awakening. So we pretty much have some level of ego self all the way up until full enlightenment, which is like at the level of the Buddha. This is when conceit is how they translated it, but it's basically the last remnants of a self-identity that is going to be with us pretty much our whole lives for all humans, unless you're fully enlightened. So, if the ego self is still there, the superego is still there. And so this is why it's important to really see this as a pattern and to work with it when we start finding some freedom, to realize when it's trying to get us to go back into the ego patterns. And in the diamond approach, which is what I mentioned, where this understanding of the superego comes from. Of course, the superego is in psychology and is well known even outside of that. But this is really, they've really figured out how this relates to the spiritual path. He calls it the donkey we ride to enlightenment. And so it's, kind of this really, this thing that is just going to be there all the way until the very end. So it's good to be able to see it and learn how to work with it. So the superego is basically, it's a coercive agency in our consciousness that's trying to get us to go back into our self-identity. So the ego psychologically is made up of self-images. So like I was saying, I'm the smart person, I'm the dumb person, I'm the this, I'm the that, whatever, we're at one end of that. We all have self-images of who we are. And those could be positive or negative, but they still make up the ego self. So self-images, defense mechanisms. So like worrying, I use that example. Worrying is a defense mechanism that's basically curiosity on overdrive. It's curiosity that is distorted by the ego self to where now there's a hypervigilance that's causing suffering. So worrying is a defense mechanism that, yes, we need to watch out for dangerous or bad things that are happening so that we can keep ourselves safe and take appropriate actions. But worrying, like especially when we're meditating, how is it helping? It's not doing anything. It's not actually solving any problems. So this is where we, when we meditate, we can see this is a defense mechanism that's happening even when I don't need it. And so when that starts going away, this is when the superego comes in. And the superego's, so I was talking about its ego structure. So there's defense mechanisms like worrying. All of the defilements and hindrances are defense mechanisms. But we can see for ourselves what our own like top 10 hits of defense mechanisms are just by meditating. If you watch and notice your patterns, you will notice the same 5 patterns. The contents may be different, but those patterns are the same every time you sit, and those exact same patterns are happening off the cushion. You're seeing the structure of your particular ego self. So that's another building block. And then beliefs is another building block psychologically of the ego self. So the superego can be positive or negative. Most of the time it's saying negative messages about us, like the one I used, the example I used for worrying. So now we're getting some freedom through our spiritual practice, through Buddhism and meditation, from compulsive worrying, to where we've got a little space, a little breathing room, maybe our stress levels going down, where when we find ourselves going into a ruminating thought pattern, we realize that now we don't just go there and make it worse to where now cortisol's going off in the brain and we're feeling awful. We can stop ourselves more, and that's when the superego will come in. And like in that case, it's more of a negative message of better, you're kind of slacking off here. You better not, get too relaxed or something bad's going to happen. These are the kinds of things we can actually hear that voice sometimes in our mind. Other times it'll be more of a feeling, like and I'll give some examples at the end, but we're trying to confront a pattern like that and we'll feel really uncomfortable not doing the pattern. Like say somebody's conflict avoidant, and they through their practice they realized they keep rehearsing conversations over and over and over in their minds. Why are they rehearsing them? Because they know they have to have a difficult conversation and they don't want to, because they're conflict avoidant. That's why that's rehearsing is happening. So I'm just using this as an example. So say this person realizes, man, I'm just totally in avoidance here, and I need to actually have a conversation. And so then the person thinks about it and they plan it out. Well, then the superego comes in and says, don't do that. You're going to ruin your relationship if you have that conversation. Just like what they were told when they were a kid. Don't talk to mommy that way. Mommy's going to give you the cold shoulder for 2 days if you talk to mommy like that. So, these are lessons we all learned as kids, but those programs, this is part of our software program. It's still in there. So if that person who's conflict avoidant was raised not learning, it's a lot better for me if I don't say anything. But now as an adult, it's like I have to have real conversations with people in my life. That's when the superego will come and try and stop the person. Or if the person does have the conversation, the superego will be in there saying, oh God, you've ruined your relationship. Look at all the damage that's happening. Or, you're never going to have another friend because you blew it, or whatever. I mean, these are the kinds of messages. The superego can also be positive. It can sort of puff us up to where we're exaggerating, where it's not just, it's fine to feel that we're doing something well. This is more like an inflation. It's more the grandiosity end. So there's the worthlessness end of the superego statements, and then there's the grandiosity end where it's like, like sometimes when people are meditating, they'll come in on retreats and tell me this is happening, that they're sitting there and they had a really good sitting and they're looking around going, wow, I might be the best meditator in the room here. or something like that. So this is, it's fine to have a good sitting, but that's like an extra layer on top. It's judgment. That's really the main thing, is that the superego has judgment, and all those judgments are basically keeping the ego in place. That's the problem with them. They're coercive agencies. So if we think about it like that, it's a way of understanding the damage that it's doing. And it's basically our 8 to 10-year-old selves interpretation of what we were heard. So when we're working with the superego, even if it's like a parental voice, we're not actually working with the parent. We're working with a construct in our own consciousness. So it's important, because if we don't work with it directly, it really limits how much we can break free of the patterns. And people will see this again on retreat. I work with this in when I'm doing one-on-one work with people in my year-long mentoring program. We work with superego, and people start actually seeing that when they start trying to, especially off the cushion, change things in your life, when you try to do it, it's like all this stuff will come that will block you from actually living what you know is a deeper truth. And there are ways to work with the superego, which I'll get to, and that's the good news. It can get quieter over time. It may be like actual messages. Like sometimes I'll ask people, what are the words that are coming at you, that are coming up? And people will hear words. And so sometimes it's like that, where you hear words. And I was giving examples of, some things a person could hear. Sometimes it gets quieter and more subtle. And sometimes, like, the superego will help you with your practice. Like, this is another way the superego gets even more and more kind of tricky. Like, people will be, let's see, where would be a way that would happen? Well, like when people start having sittings where it's actually getting calmer, and the superego might come in and say, well, you should be having this happening in your practice. Why isn't that happening? And now, instead of just being in the present moment, enjoying a good moment of practice, now there's a sense, oh, well, I'm not far enough. Not enough is happening. There's more should be happening right now than what is in my practice. So this is a way that the superego even can come in and start being sneaky and helping us in ways that it's hard to see at first, unless you know that the superego is there. And there's also a spiritual superego. So when we're on the spiritual path, and in Buddhism, they've kind of used spiritual ideals. So the ego ideal is another thing that the superego will try to get us to be. So whatever our ideal of who we should be, the superego will keep pushing us to that ideal that, again, often is programmed into us by parents or society, of how we should be. So anytime there's a should that's happening, that is the superego. That you should, like, say a friend does something really, really damaging, and maybe they don't mean to do it. Well, the superego might come in and say, well, you shouldn't be bothered by that. You should be above that. And now, if we're Buddhist on top of it, good Buddhists don't feel anger about these things. You're not a good Buddhist if you feel anger. Well, now all of a sudden we're not in the present moment. If anger's there, we don't have to act it out, but we can at least feel it, so we're actually dealing with reality instead of pushing it into the subconscious. So this is the danger, is that the superego takes us out of the present moment with all these shoulds. And now we're just stuffing these things down into the unconscious because we shouldn't be feeling that. And this is part of how scandals happen. I mean, I say this a lot, but like, how is it that a spiritual teacher could thousands and thousands of times, we know now we have 80 to 90,000 thoughts a day, all of us. And 80 to 90% of those thoughts are repetitive. They're the same thoughts we had yesterday and the day before and the week before and the month before and the year before. So how could somebody have thoughts of, sleeping with a student tens, hundreds of thousands of times and never once go, gosh, maybe I should work with this instead of acting it out. But then they just go and act it out because it gets pushed into the subconscious because we don't want to admit that that's happening, that those thoughts and feelings are coming up. So we all do this to some extent. If we have the superego telling us we should or shouldn't be having a thought or a feeling, we just suppress it and then it leaks out in other ways. So this is where in Buddhism, we have the tools to actually work with difficult emotions that come up without acting them out. And but not if the superego is just pushing it down to where we can't hear it. And also we can't be in the present moment. If we're actually, say, feeling anger at something somebody did, we can be with the anger, and like anything else, it's impermanent. Eventually it goes away. So if we stay with it long enough, we can actually have that arise and pass without acting in a triggered way. And then we can see if we actually need to say anything or not. Maybe it's something that doesn't require saying something. Maybe it does. And then we can say something from a place of non-triggering, but not if we push it into the subconscious. Then we're going to pretend like it didn't bother us, and it's going to leak out all over the place. So these are all reasons to work with the superego because it's not helping us in our practice. So how do we identify it? Well, a feeling of being shamed, bad, like, the superego, in German, this all came from German. We have the ego, and then we have the uber ego. So it's over. So there's a feeling of us being the little one, and we're being shamed by the big one, because basically when we're in this, we're in our child self. We're not in our mature adult self when we're at the effect of the superego. We're basically reverting to a child self who's being shamed by the big one that we have to listen to. We feel bad. There's shoulds. Anytime there's shoulds, that's a superego. I mean, we can act with integrity because it's the right thing to do, not because there's a should. So it's a different feeling when we are actually in our mature adult self and we know that something is in integrity than it is when we're doing something because there's a coercive agency in our consciousness making us stay in the ego pattern, basically. So we could feel small, or we could feel puffed up and grandiose, like I talked about. So, there's a way where we can actually own the things that we are good at without it being grandiose. And then it's just part of truth. And there's a difference there between grandiosity, where the superego is telling us how great we are. It's just a way of keeping those ego patterns going. And a lot of comparing mind gets into this too, where there's comparing mind. Anytime there's comparing mind, usually there's some kind of judgment happening, judging I'm better or worse than others. So that's another way that we can kind of go into, okay, what's that about? Why is there a need to compare instead of just be with how it is for me? Wisdom and wise action and reflection doesn't happen when we're in our 5-year-old superego. We can't actually be in a wise adult place when we're the little one being shamed. That's not a place of wisdom and spiritual capacity and understanding. So sometimes people will think that they need to keep the superego because it keeps them in line. So that's another part of it that we can feel into, okay, what's really happening here? Do I believe it? Do I believe the superego? And that's where what we're doing the way that we work with it is called defending against the superego. And I'll get to that in a minute. I've talked about spiritual ideals where religions actually have used this phenomena in our consciousness. Religions have used it to kind of keep people in line. and Buddhism is a lot better than most, but renunciation was really about the only way that the instinctual drives that are part of every mammal, including humans. And I've just given talks on the three instinctual drives of self-preservation, the sexual instinct or the one-on-one drive, and the social instinct. And we all have these, and they've been really hard to deal with until we had psychology. So religions basically used renunciation to take care of those, take away your stuff so you don't own anything, so you can't get into bickering and fights and warring over things, over stuff. So just take it all away. You don't own anything, so that's not going to happen. Theoretically, we don't have sex. We're celibate. Don't have children. And then the social instinct, we don't have families. The people in the monastery are now your family. So you give up all those things, and that's pretty much how they worked with those drives, was through renunciation. So, that was really holding up a spiritual ideal of just repress those things. Don't feel them. Just take them away. Don't have them in your life. But if you're a householder, you're going to have all of those things in your life. And so this is really where, how do I work with these very primitive drives skillfully? Well, if we're allowing ourselves to actually feel what's happening rather than the superego coming and saying you shouldn't be feeling that, that's a much better way to actually digest those, whatever's arising, rather than just trying to stuff it into our unconscious. So to work with it then is, the first thing is to actually see that this is happening. So the main way to see it is what I was saying. You can feel you're being shamed, you're bad, you're wrong, there's shoulds, there's a sense of like you're trying to break free of a pattern, but something keeps trying to put you back into the pattern. These are all ways to know the superego and to see that it's happening. Really, if you can feel that sense of being shamed, that's a really good one, because when we actually are doing something out of our integrity, there's not a sense of shame. That's not why we're doing whatever it is that we're doing. There's more of a sense of alignment and integrity. We're not doing it because we're going to be shamed if we do it or don't do it. So the first thing is to see it. And we can't actually reason with the superego. We can't use metta. Like sometimes people will feel the superego really, being harsh. A lot of people have really harsh, mean superegos. And people will try and use metta on the superego. This is a coercive agency in your consciousness. So, this isn't another human. This is like they'll try to be kind. So in internal family systems is a therapy that's used widely now. And I've worked with a lot of students who use it. And sometimes if one is doing internal family systems therapy, there is a way that they have the superego be a part that you can work with inclusively. But even the people I've known who worked with IFS a lot, eventually they have to do what I'm going to say with the superego to get some space from it. So that's really what we want to do. We want to get space from it by separating from it. Because what happened when we were kids, we couldn't do that with the adults around us. We needed those adults just for our survival. Basically, we had to do what the adults said and wanted to be okay in our environment. So all of our defense mechanisms are there for good reasons. We did what we needed to be okay. It's just the question is now, do we need to keep holding on to those defenses as a compulsive part of who we think we are? And really, the whole journey of Buddhism is trying to help us get free from those. So this is where getting some space and just, I'm not listening to you. I don't believe you. these are things we can kind of say to the superego in terms of having it back off from this oppressive stance that it has towards us. So there's more to that. There are some good books on the superego. Soul Without Shame by Byron Brown is one of them. You can look that up on Amazon, and there are workshops and other things where you actually get some practice working with this. I work with people with this all the time in their practice when it's coming up, especially when people are trying to break out of patterns. That's when we see it a lot. So that is basically how we work with the superego to try and get some space so that it's not kind of controlling and keeping us in a limited place of the ego self. So I think I've given enough examples there, and I will now open it up to questions or comments. Yes, Joe Beth.
Okay, now I'm good.
Good.
Yes, this is fascinating, and it seems like we were talking about emotions, and it's okay to feel. It's okay to be angry. This is when this question came up for me. It's okay to feel angry because people do that, and it's nothing. So my question around that is like, okay, what about how angry makes the body feel? And that's how I know I'm angry often, is it's not just a thought that says, oh, you're angry. It's first of all, I can just feel the contraction in them. And as those things repeat themselves over and over during your lifetime, then there you are, chronically like that. So, can you make some comments?
Yes, absolutely. And that was one of my examples that I didn't get to. It was anger. So thank you for bringing that in, because of course it's a natural human emotion and we all feel it, even if we don't admit it. We all feel it. So anger is it's one of the hindrances and defilements. It's under aversion. Aversion has hatred, anger, and fear. So it's basically a pushing, I need to get this thing away, because if I get it away, then that'll be a lot better. Things will be better. And anger is more of a hot feeling where we like to sort of punch the person, whereas hatred's more of a cold, where like I'm just going to annihilate them and just eliminate them. It's more like anger's more red and hatred's more black. And hatred's even more taboo than anger. So at least we have books now that say, anger, if you feeling anger is okay, but hatred, man, that's even more taboo. So anger, it's a defense mechanism, like all the defilements are, all of our patterns. It's one that if we feel into anger, it can be pretty interesting. So this is part of what we do with Vipassana, is we feel, like you said, the body. That's great that you know it because of the body. So feeling the body sensation of the anger, it might feel like heat in the chest. Or how do you experience, Joe? It sounds like you know that part of how you know it is from the body and how your body feels.
Well, I do feel it in my chest. My breath changes, and it's a chronic thing because I as a child, I got asthma, and because I couldn't express my anger, I had to be a good girl, and when I learned about that, and I recognized that through my practice and how I learned, but uh, I still have asthma. I mean, it's not. So, is there some actual that you were talking about ways to heal and the techniques and things? Are there some things that you can share with us that how to deal with those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing is to see. So this is great because with this with something like anger, there can be a lot of self-judgment and also messages. Like you said, it wasn't okay to be angry, especially for women. I mean, it's true for men also, but there's a little more room for men. There's a little less room for women, and girls. But it's, everybody has to suppress anger as children. Our parents don't want us to be expressing that. So we can, and I've heard sometimes they say asthma is like the suppressed screaming out, as a health. It's a way the body is like, pushing it down. I mean, I'm sure there's medical reasons too, but I've heard that. Yeah. So it's great that you've seen all this in your practice. So in the categories of practice, and as you probably remember, I teach the 4 categories that they now have discovered in neuroscience, which happen to correspond with the 4 practice categories in Buddhism, which is wonderful. Each category would deal with something like anger differently. So we've got a lot of tools in Buddhism to work with it. The first thing would be to see, especially like with the Vipassana, would be to see if you can take any self-judgment about having the anger. So this is, if we start right at the beginning with just having the superego part that says you shouldn't have anger, to see if we can back that off so that we can actually be with how it is. This is part of how the superego, knowing this, there might be like, do you have any sense of self-judgment about it, or is that faded over time as you've worked with anger?
It's fading for sure, but it's hard to believe that it's not there at all.
Yeah, right.
Our culture is just
right. The culture, right. So this is where if we can take the superego off, we can actually be with the truth. Okay, what's true in the moment? If I'm in the present moment and anger's there, and I say, no, there's no anger there, I'm not in the present moment anymore. So, I mean, any real legitimate meditation is bringing us into the present moment. So in Vipassana, that would be the place I would recommend starting, is to actually feel the anger, like what you've been doing. Feel how it is in the body, feel your heart, feeling hot or whatever it is that's happening, and just let yourself feel it without the judgment. That's where knowing that the superego is going to try to have you not feel it is a way to just say, okay, I've got anger. Every human on the planet has had anger. Every human. There's a human that hasn't had anger. This is part of the human condition. So just to feel it, to let yourself feel it, to bring some breath in, to just give it some space, and to let it be there, because anger is a distortion of strength. So underneath the anger, if everything's coming from the ground of being, everything that arises has within it something that is pure. So anger is a distortion of strength. So if we really just let ourselves feel it, a lot of times with anger, there's a feeling of self-righteousness that feels really good at first. Like, I'm angry because they did me wrong and they shouldn't be doing this, and whatever. But a lot of times if we feel into the anger, the self-righteousness kind of feels good at first because it's giving us some strength back. It's a way when we don't have it to feel it. It's a false strength.
Yeah.
So a lot of times if we stay
energizing.
Right, it's like I've got some strength, so it's an attempt to get that back. A lot of times if we keep feeling the anger, something else will be under it, like powerlessness or a helplessness or a hurt. And really the only way we can feel a capacity is to have the anger in the face of the whatever is happening that we actually maybe are helpless to deal with, which of course children have all the time. They are helpless, and as adults, you look out at the world, look at all the things we can't do anything about. All you have to do is look at the news for 5 minutes to start feeling either helpless or angry. So this is where if we just stay with it, we can actually give it some space to know more about what's there, because we don't want to be with the fact that there's so much in life that we actually can't do anything about.
Some of the things that I have done that seem to help are just writing down the way I'm thinking and feeling, and then that seems to help. And also screaming, if I'm in a safe place where I can scream.
Yeah.
It's like the energy just builds up in my body if I don't do something to move it out.
That's great. Those are great things to do. So this is where, the Vipassana, really what we see when we're really doing it is that everything's impermanent, which is the good news. Mm-hmm. And if we stay with something long enough, it will turn into something else and it will dissipate if we actually let ourselves be with it. And a lot of times there's something underneath it that is harder to be with, that is the anger can maybe be masking. So this is how in Vipassana, we let ourselves be with what is actually here without judgment, with taking the superego off. The other practices, like if we're doing the next one, I would suggest would be a heart practice to have some compassion for yourself. Mm-hmm. And some loving kindness, whichever one feels better, for whatever the situation is that's causing the anger. So that's a place where we can bring some self-soothing in. But again, only if we actually admit what's happening. If the superego is there blocking what's happening, saying, no, you shouldn't be angry, we can't actually work with any of this. So, in samatha, the way samatha helps is it helps us turn away from ruminating thoughts and to just be with something peaceful, which is the breath. So if we find, like, say we're angry and we're just going over and over and over the situation that made us angry, we're kind of hurting ourselves there.
Right.
So that's where, just coming back to the breath, the samatha is helping us learn how to turn away. And then the fourth category of the Dzogchen, if we have access to non-duality, to our deeper nature, we can notice that. And with that spaciousness, it makes the thing seem smaller when we're really in touch with that part of our deeper nature. So, it sounds like you've worked really skillfully with the superego, where you've allowed yourself to actually be with the fact that it's there.
Yeah.
So the superego part of it, since that's the topic for tonight, would be to just, acknowledge that it's a natural human emotion, and that we can feel it without having to act it out. When we're kids, when we had to suppress these things because the adults around us didn't want us to be angry at them or our sibling or whoever, we suppressed it when we're little, and when we start reclaiming these things, oftentimes we pick it back up at the age it got suppressed. So we might pick it back up at how it was for us at the age of 5 or 10 or whatever, and we might not be that skillful. So that's why it's really important to use the Vipassana we can sit with it and not have to act it out. And if we actually sit with it long enough, it does it's impermanent and it will turn into something else and tap off. So hopefully that was helpful with what you're doing, but it sounds like everything you're doing is skillful means. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Kurt. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Tina. Thanks for this talk. It's been, I don't even have good words for it. But
Sure.
so when you started to talk with how to deal with it, the first thing I heard you say is to basically say to yourself, I'm not listening to you. Would you? So for me, more than anger, I think lately fear has been really showing up.
Uh-huh. Right. So this is what you're saying to the superego for the fear itself. So this is we want to kind of separate out the actual personality patterning of the fear. We might be afraid of the superego too, but we want to separate out the actual personality pattern from the superego that's reinforcing us staying in the pattern. So just to make that distinction. So what's happening
Could you say that again?
Yeah, so you might see fear, like how are you experiencing the fear? How are you noticing it? Is it in meditation or or off the cushion?
It's both, but actually what happened for me is a couple of years ago, my meditation practice became difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't able to sit with things and I started ruminating a lot.
Mm-hmm. And was fear part of that, or where did that fear come from?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay, so you were ruminating about things that were fearful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So with fear, with any of any patterns that we have, the first thing we do with them is, depending, were you doing Vipassana or what practice were you doing?
Primarily Vipassana.
Yeah. So with fear is hard to be close to. So we have to be real gentle with ourselves because it's tender and there sometimes even is trauma underlying it. So we want to be real gentle and sensitive with ourselves. And this is where with fear in Vipassana, we might need to fairly early on bring in one of the Brahma Viharas, either loving kindness or compassion, whichever one feels better, because it's a hard place to be close to in the heart.
So would you go a little bit because again, when you started to talk about how to deal with them, I literally wrote down in all capital letters, I'm not listening to you. So,
right. Yeah. Well, that's with the superego. So the superego is, with the fear, if you're doing Vipassana, you're not using the I'm not listening to you to the fear. In Vipassana, when there's a pattern coming up other than the superego, we're actually seeing if we can be with it. We're sort of learning how to be with it because everything's impermanent and will arise and pass away. And oftentimes it's something like fear. The fear of the fear is almost as bad as the fear itself. So this is where seeing if you can, what happens if you try to just be with the fear a little bit?
That is what I've been working with. And there are times I can stay with it. And there are times I come to a point and I just go,
right. And this is where using the Brahma Viharas to bring in some self-soothing is really important with something like fear, because our nervous systems need to be soothed. So bringing in some loving kindness for yourself or some compassion would be kind of the next place to work with fear. Do you have judgment about yourself for having the fear?
Yes.
That's the superego. So we're teasing apart some different things. So this is where with the superego, fear, again, is a natural human emotion. I know we're going over a little bit, but I'd like to be able to, kind of see if we can, I can answer the question and then we'll add. The superego this would be where having the superego back off, you don't need to be judging yourself for having the fear. It's a natural human emotion, and being able to work within in Vipassana so that it can be digested and opened up. If you have the superego back off, there's no need to judge yourself for having it. So this is really where the superego part of it is a little distinct. Is what I'm saying making sense?
It is.
Yeah. So then, because that will make it hard to actually be with the fear in a way that it can get opened up and worked with and digested. So this is where, again, using all four categories, just the way I said with Joe Beth, with fear, really we can get very triggered in our nervous system. So we want to bring in some self-soothing with the Brahma Viharas, where it's like, may I be safe? May I be healthy? Going through your phrases to bring some soothing so that you can actually tap off some of the fear and the hardness to be with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, we could probably talk about this topic for a while, but at least this gives you kind of a sense of how to work with the superego, how it functions in your consciousness, and even just being aware that it's arising can help you get a little bit of freedom from it so that you can actually digest these patterns that are underneath it that the superego just is shaming you about. All of these are natural human emotions. And when we can actually work with our patterns, that's when they start opening up and getting digested more. And that's really what the world needs today. When we change our own consciousness even a little bit, that goes into the collective. So I just, bow to all of your practice that what you're doing on the cushion is actually helping all those people that we were sending compassion to, because we're having our own consciousness have less defilements that lead to some of the horrific things that are happening on the planet. So be well, and may our practice benefit all beings and continue to benefit all beings everywhere.